The War of Rebirth. When humans and Taraxians unite to build a new future for the universe. We don't know exactly what led to Kian Koa's capture. He only remembers the numb feeling as he was surrounded by strange creatures, their eyes glowing red, and the sound of footsteps like thunder. Everything happened so quickly, and now Kian was sitting in an underground interrogation room on the planet Amir, his mind still fuzzy about what had happened. The Taraxian invaders had attacked Earth, and he, a mechanical engineer, had been a victim of that assault. Under the dim lights, the stone walls of the room seemed to suffocate him. But not out of fear, rather, it was the oppressive silence. Kian looked around, assessing every detail calmly, his eyes betraying no hint of fear. This wasn't the first time he had faced dangerous situations. Earth had taught him how to survive through countless life-threatening scenarios. The interrogation room door opened, and a tall woman stepped in. Celia Terra, a Taraxian warrior, her cold gaze and confident demeanor piercing. She looked at Kian as though he were just a small prey, but Kian only smiled faintly, his face nothing but calm. "You're human, aren't you?" Celia asked, her voice heavy, sounding more like a question than a statement. Kian looked at her, his gaze as nonchalant as if he were looking at an old friend. "Not exactly. I'm Kian Koa, a mechanical engineer, and I have no intention of doing anything harmful to you," he replied. Celia raised an eyebrow. She couldn't understand why Kian remained so calm. Those who were captured would usually be fearful. Humans couldn't be without fear, especially in this situation. They had been defeated, and now they were in the hands of the enemy. "Aren't you afraid?" Celia asked again, curiosity clear in her tone. This question wasn't just a test, but also a challenge. Kian remained silent for a moment, as though pondering the question. Then he smiled faintly. "Fear is an interesting concept, isn't it? But I think fear is just a reaction to ignorance. If we understand the nature of everything, there's nothing to fear." Celia frowned slightly. What was he talking about? Every invading species knew fear, but this was a human, the weak creatures on Earth, beings who had only just developed a little technology and warfare. She had never met a human like Kian before. He wasn't afraid, he was strangely confident. "Do you really think humanity can defeat us?" Celia asked, her disdain unmistakable. "A weak species like yours, how could you face the Taraxians?" Kian didn't rush to respond. He looked into Celia's eyes intently, his eyes filled with calm and clarity, like the eyes of a strategist. "You may be strong physically, but humanity is strong in intellect. We've turned war into an industry. You only know how to defeat, but we know how to create victory." Celia looked at him, her eyes filled with suspicion. She didn't know that Kian's words were raising a big question in her mind, a question no one had dared to ask before. Kian wasn't just a captive. He was a different kind of human, one the Taraxians had never encountered. Not because he was physically strong, but because he was strong in his way of thinking. His words weren't boastful. They were the truth behind a grand strategy. And if she wasn't careful, these strategies could change the course of the war. But Celia couldn't admit that right away. She shook her head, trying to refocus on the interrogation. Yet deep inside, she began to feel a strange unease, a doubt she had never experienced before. Perhaps Kian wasn't just an ordinary mechanical engineer. Perhaps he was someone carrying a plan she couldn't yet understand. And from this moment, the war was no longer just about two species. It was a battle of intellect, creativity, and survival. Kian didn't hurry to respond to Celia's question. He knew that every word he spoke now could change how she viewed humanity. A war wasn't always a simple confrontation of brute strength. Sometimes it was a battle of wits, a race between strategies and decisions of life or death. But he also understood that when it came to war, humanity didn't just have one powerful weapon, it had endless creativity. "To give you a better understanding, I'll tell you a story." Kian spoke gently, his voice calm, yet full of challenge. "In the past, we humans were no different from other species. We were weak creatures, hunted by stronger beings. But there was one thing we could do, we could learn." Celia narrowed her eyes, not fully understanding Kian's point, but she stayed silent, allowing him to continue. "We started with simple wars, just fighting with crude tools. But then we realized something: war isn't just about defeating the enemy. It's about controlling the situation, creating circumstances that the enemy can't predict. We developed tools not to kill, but to win with intellect." Celia felt confused. Kian's words seemed like a strong assertion about the nature of war, but at the same time they started to make her doubt. She looked at him again, and this time she could see more clearly the determination in his eyes. So what kind of warfare technologies has humanity developed? Celia asked, trying to maintain composure in her voice. If you can't defeat us with strength, then what do you intend to do? Kian wasn't shy. He looked at her slowly as if telling a friend about great accomplishments. We've invented things you never even considered. First information warfare is a strategy not using weapons, but the understanding of information. We learned how to blind the enemy, control information, and make them unaware of what's really happening. He paused for a moment, looking directly into Celia's eyes as if wanting her to understand that he was sharing a huge secret. We create weapons not to kill, but to make the enemy destroy themselves. That's why we've been able to survive for so long and face other species. We always find ways to never be defeated. Celia remained silent, a strange feeling rising within her. Kian's words weren't lies or boasts. She felt that humanity truly had a solid strategy, an unpredictable power. It seemed they had turned warfare into a science, and that's why the Taraxians couldn't easily wipe them out. So what you're saying is that we, the Taraxians, are just pawns in humanity's game? Celia asked, trying to appear unshaken. Do you really think humanity can defeat us with these strategies? Kian smiled faintly, not out of joy, but because of a deep understanding of the war. No, I don't think Taraxians are pawns, but you're not invincible either. Every strategy has weaknesses, and if we can find that weakness, victory will belong to humanity. Kian began to tell of one of the terrifying war strategies humanity had developed. He didn't just talk about advanced weapons or psychological warfare tactics, but also about exploiting the enemy's weaknesses. Humanity, with all its creativity and intelligence, has learned to understand the weaknesses of other species and exploit them to the fullest. We create war not just to win a battle, but to change the entire course of the war, Kian explained. We develop tactics that make the enemy unable to predict our next move. And more than that, we do it in such a way that when the Taraxians realize what's happening, it's already too late. Celia listened carefully, but in her heart, doubt remained. Was what Kian said really true, or was it just an excuse for humanity's weakness? So what's your intention while you're here? Celia asked, trying to remain calm, though deep down she felt an unusual sense of worry. If you can win with intellect, then why let yourself be captured like this? Kian smirked, not answering immediately. He thought for a moment before speaking. Sometimes those who are captured are the ones who change the game. When you understand that victory doesn't just depend on strength, but on playing the right cards, you'll understand why I'm still here, even though I could have done many things to escape the situation. At that moment, Celia realized she didn't fully understand humanity. And more importantly, Kian was the first person who made her question everything she had ever thought about the invincibility of the Taraxians. Kian sat up straight, his eyes never leaving Celia. The words he was about to speak would completely change the course of the war, but he understood that even in this situation, every word must be carefully considered. A slip of the tongue could make him lose his only chance to achieve his goal. Celia stared at him, her eyes as cold as stones, but deep inside she sensed something unusual. Kian was not an easily deceived man. She wondered if there was something hidden behind his calmness. You know, Celia, Kian began, his voice gentle but filled with implication. We humans have a saying, nothing is absolute in war. Everything can change with one wrong move or one right decision at the right time, and you unfortunately have found yourself in a situation you don't know about. Celia furrowed her brow, not understanding what Kian was trying to say. A shiver ran down her spine. Her suspicion of humanity grew deeper, but Kian didn't rush to explain further. He simply continued. Do you know that there are those within the Taraxian ranks who have joined forces with humanity? Kian asked, his gaze still fixed on Celia's face. Celia was stunned, unable to believe what she had just heard. What do you mean? She almost couldn't speak, her doubts now turning into a sense of overwhelming confusion. His words hit her like a lightning bolt. Kian smiled faintly, a strange and mysterious smile. You're not hearing things. There's a group within your ranks that has betrayed their own army. They've joined forces with humanity, providing information and supporting us quietly without anyone knowing. Celia couldn't believe her ears. His words felt like a punch to the face, leaving her disoriented and lost. Since the war began, the Taraxians had always been proud of their unity and strength. How could there be traitors in their ranks? How could these powerful warriors turn their backs on their own kind? But why? Celia asked, her voice dry, as if she couldn't breathe. Why would they do that? Kian didn't answer immediately. He silently stared at her before continuing. Because they realize that the Taraxians aren't the most powerful species in the universe. You have strength, but you also have ambition, and that ambition will make you make mistakes. The traitors in your army understood that if you continued the war the way you've been in the end, you would only destroy yourselves. Celia felt a surge of disbelief rise within her. She couldn't accept that there were traitors in the Taraxian ranks. It was an unforgivable betrayal, a stain that no warrior could bear. But are you sure about this? Celia couldn't hide the doubt in her voice. Do you have proof? Kian nodded slightly. I can't reveal everything right now, but you can check the sources of the information we've received. The traitors in your ranks have provided us with strategies, vital information that no one else knew. And I'll just add that this betrayal is the reason your war effort has started to weaken. Celia felt like a wave was crashing over her mind. Every word from Kian felt like a sharp blade cutting into her pride and the Taraxian sense of superiority. Humans, the creatures she had once considered weak, not only had the ability to fight, but could defeat them with strategy and cunning. You're saying that humanity could win not through strength, but through our own betrayal? Celia asked, her voice lowered, an overwhelming sense of suffocation rising in her chest. Yes, Kian replied confidently. Humanity doesn't fight alone, and you, if you're not careful, will find yourselves caught in a war that you no longer have control over. Celia looked at Kian, feeling like a fire was burning in her chest. She had never felt so weak, but at the same time anger began to rise. Betrayal, even from her own comrades, was something unacceptable. If what Kian said was true, this war was no longer just a fight between two species. It was a battle between life and death, and betrayal was the most dangerous weapon. So what do we do now? Celia asked, a part of her, still unable to believe what she had just heard. Kian smiled, but his smile wasn't one of triumph. We must act. If you don't believe me, at least look at what's happening around us. You'll see the truth. At that moment, Celia realized that everything had changed. She was no longer a proud Taraxian warrior. She was someone who had been deceived, standing on the brink of betrayal, not only from the humans, but from her own comrades. When Kian said the war had changed, Celia didn't immediately understand. But over time, his words gradually became an undeniable truth. The traitor group within the Taraxian ranks hadn't just provided information to humanity, they had begun taking small but strategic actions. Taraxian warriors who had been trained to be indifferent now stood between two worlds: loyalty to their organization and betrayal of their comrades. This caused an unimaginable shock to Celia. She, a proud warrior who had dedicated her life to protecting the Taraxians, now had to face betrayal from those she once considered allies. Kian's words began to disturb her mind, but soon the terrifying truth surged within her like an unquenchable fire. Celia had no choice but to face the truth that this war was no longer just between two species. It was a war between trust and betrayal, between pride and fear. What will you do? Kian asked, his tone calm, as if he knew this was the most critical moment. You can continue fighting for a cause that has been betrayed, or you can rise up and change everything. The question paralyzed Celia. She didn't know what to do. It felt like the entire universe was pressing down on her shoulders. The Taraxian warriors, those she had once admired and fought beside, were now turning their backs on her. And in that moment, she couldn't help but wonder if she was standing at a pivotal point in history. Kian didn't wait for her answer. He knew she would have to wrestle with herself. But time waits for no one. The war had to go on, and victory never waits for hesitation. Just as Celia began to realize that she couldn't go back to the past, humanity's warships suddenly appeared in the sky over Ymir. A powerful cosmic wind swept through, and the strange spacecraft of humanity appeared, bombarding Taraxian strategic points. The traitor warriors who had joined humanity's alliance began to deploy the strategies Kian had shared earlier. Celia watched as humanity's spaceships glided across the sky, their blue lights shimmering like distant stars. Waves of attacks from humanity made her widen her eyes in disbelief. She had fought and lived believing that the Taraxians were the peak of strength, but now humanity's creativity was completely altering the course of the war. You were right, Kian, Celia whispered, realizing that humanity wasn't simple. You're not just powerful because of strength, but because of your skill and strategy. Kian simply looked at her and nodded, showing neither satisfaction nor complacency. He knew that the story wasn't over. The traitor warriors within the Taraxian ranks were now not only helping humanity win, but they had made betrayal a strategic tool. It was a turning point that Celia couldn't ignore. The war began to escalate as Celia realized her army was being torn apart from the inside out. The traitors weren't just reporting strategic positions, they were changing the way Taraxian warriors operated. The tactics being deployed were in directions the Taraxians could not foresee, and every attack had been meticulously prepared in advance. You can decide, Kian continued, not letting Celia lose focus. Humanity doesn't fight for power. We fight for survival. You can do the same. You can rise up and change the war stand with those Taraxian warriors who have betrayed you for conscience's sake, instead of continuing to fight a meaningless war. Celia looked around, her eyes now showing a major shift. The Taraxian warriors were beginning to lose trust in each other. Humanity's ships weren't just attacking fiercely, they were persuading the Taraxian warriors to act for their own ideals, not for conquest, but for the future of the universe. You can change this, Kian repeated, urging her to make a decision. She stood there silently looking at her army, the warriors she had once fought beside, but now they were no longer the comrades she had imagined. In the end, Celia made her decision. She could no longer stand with the invaders, no longer support their cruel actions. She would stand with the traitors, those Taraxian warriors, fighting for a better cause. And thus the real battle began. A battle not just between humans and Taraxians, but between resilient hearts and those seeking to overthrow the system. A battle about choices and sacrifice. When Celia decided to stand with humanity, an indescribable tension began to spread in her heart. She was not only facing the battle, but also facing herself, confronting the betrayal she had to acknowledge. But it was in that moment that she felt something new, a strength she had never experienced before: the freedom of choice. She was no longer a tool serving the ambitions of the Taraxians, but now she was someone who could determine the outcome of this war. Kian observed her, noticing the change in Celia's gaze. He didn't say anything more, just gave a slight nod, as if everything had already been decided. For him, what mattered most wasn't the victory or defeat in the war, but the decisions each person had to make when faced with perilous situations. Celia had chosen to stand by the truth, and that was all he needed to move forward. Meanwhile, humanity's spaceships continued to intensify their attacks, weakening the Taraxian army. The traitor warriors, no longer concealing their shift, began to act more decisively. They were no longer silent traitors, but warriors standing on the battlefield as humanity's allies. They helped break Taraxian defense systems, enabling humanity's warships to infiltrate strategic areas of the Emir planet. Celia and Kian stood together, one a Taraxian warrior, the other a human mechanical engineer. They were no longer former enemies, but had become unofficial allies, forced to cooperate to confront a greater force than their own hatred. Kian looked into Celia's eyes, sensing a determination, something more powerful than all the weapons in the universe. You know, Celia, Kian said softly, when humans fight, we don't just use weapons. We use our mind's creativity and the ability to overcome adversity. And I think you're the same. Celia nodded, though she didn't speak. Kian's words had carved themselves deeply into her mind. She was no longer a lone warrior, but now a part of something bigger. She had to fight not only for the Taraxians, but for a higher ideal because of the change she had chosen. They stood together in silence, their understanding communicated through their gaze. From now on, Celia and Kian were not two separate individuals in a war. They were symbols of change, of an opportunity to rebuild everything that had been broken. The attack continued, and the cooperation between the traitors and humanity was no longer concealed. The Taraxian army began to feel a profound loss. The traitor warriors had set up false alarm systems, making it impossible for Taraxian fighters to differentiate between real and false targets. They got lost, distracted, and gradually became ineffective in battle. Celia watched this scene with surprise and disappointment. Her warriors, those she had once fought alongside, were now being deceived by their own comrades. Every attack from humanity was precise, Every move by the traitors was like a blade cutting into her pride. "We've lost," Celia whispered, her voice lowered. Kian didn't immediately respond. He understood that Celia was going through complex emotions, and he didn't want to add to her pain. "It's not a loss," he said finally. "You've changed, and that's the most important thing." This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something new. The traitor warriors were no longer just participants in a war. They were creating a revolution. Both humanity and the Terraxians had to learn how to live in a world where loyalty was no longer the sole factor in determining victory. Kian looked at the sky over Ymir, where humanity's warships were flying, swiftly destroying Terraxian facilities and bases. He knew this war wasn't over, but a change had begun when Celia decided to stand by the truth. A small step, but the right one. Celia and Kian were no longer enemies. They were allies in a war not just to survive, but to change everything about how war and power were defined in this universe. The war had become increasingly brutal. Humanity's relentless attacks were drawing the Terraxian army into a vortex of chaos. The traitor warriors continued to play their crucial role, weakening the enemy's morale from within. However, Celia couldn't help but feel the cost of this change. She knew her decisions wouldn't just affect the current war, but also her future and the future of the Terraxians. At an abandoned base on Ymir, Kian was held in a dimly lit interrogation room. Yet he no longer felt the same despair he once did. The help from the traitor warriors within the Terraxian ranks had caused a dramatic reversal. The interrogation room, once a place of torment, had now become the place where he would decide whether he could escape and join the final battle. Suddenly, in a quiet moment, a strange signal rang out from the surveillance system in the base. Kian raised an eyebrow, realizing that this signal wasn't coming from an ordinary Terraxian warrior. He silently thanked the traitor warriors for helping him establish contact with the human rescue ship. Time was running out. He knew that this was his only chance to escape captivity. At the same time, Celia stood at a distance observing. Humanity's warships had begun to reinforce their forces. The flow of the battle had now shifted away from the Terraxians. She saw the human rescue ships appear in the sky, their light cutting through the darkness of Ymir. These ships didn't just bring hope for Kian, they also brought an opportunity for Celia to end the war. Humanity's rescue ships flew across the sky, bombarding Terraxian defenses, opening the way for the traitor warriors and humans to enter the base. Kian stood by the window, watching the warships streak past their bright beams illuminating the area. He felt the freedom drawing near, a powerful surge rising within him. He knew he wasn't just escaping captivity, he was joining the battle that would decide humanity's fate. "We've won, Celia," Kian whispered as he saw the rescue ship approaching. "This war isn't just about survival. It's about choosing to stand up for what's right. You made the right choice." Celia looked at the human warships, her eyes glimmering with determination. She knew this war would never be the same again. Though the war wasn't over, humanity had created an opportunity for itself and for all who dared to stand against oppression. She had witnessed humanity's strength not only through strategy, but also through its perseverance, through its ability to unite and fight for freedom. "You'll come with us, won't you?" Kian asked, looking into Celia's eyes once again, full of hope and trust. Celia didn't answer immediately, but her eyes showed a clear change. She was no longer a Terraxian warrior. She was a warrior for freedom, for truth, and for all that humanity had taught her. "I'll go with you," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I will fight alongside you to change this world." As the rescue ship approached, a dramatic rescue took place. The human warriors and the traitor Terraxian warriors entered the base, cutting off all of Terraxian's defensive lines. The human spacecraft landed, shelling key strongholds. In the chaos, Kian was freed from his cell. He quickly boarded the ship alongside Celia, and the traitor warriors determined to take back victory from the invaders. When the human rescue ship ascended into the sky, Kian stood by the window looking down at Ymir, which was slowly darkening under the waves of attacks. He knew that war didn't always end in a flash, but today this war had created a change that humanity would never forget. The rescue ship flew across the sky and the battle continued, but now humanity was no longer alone. They had Terraxian warriors standing by their side, and the traitors had not only changed the course of the war, but had redefined what victory could mean. The human rescue ships ascended, and as the light from the jet engines illuminated the surface of Ymir, the war entered its decisive phase. After enduring the brutality of the war for so long, Kian and Celia now stood aboard a human warship, gazing at the planet that had once been the site of fierce battles. This strange scene made them reflect on everything that had happened and what awaited them in the future. Celia stood beside Kian, her gaze no longer bearing the hardened look of a Taraxian warrior, but now filled with contemplation and determination. She had made the right choice, and now she knew that she was fighting not only for humanity, but for the future of this universe. Her heart no longer carried hatred, but a strong belief in change. Kian observed her quietly, sensing the shift in Celia's mindset. He knew this wasn't easy, but they had come a long way together. And though the war was not over, at least they had proven one thing: humanity was not just a victim of war, but also a force capable of changing the course of the universe. "We did it," Kian said, his voice filled with confidence and optimism. "We've changed this war." Celia nodded but didn't respond immediately. She looked towards the human warships surrounding Ymir, the colossal ships slowly dominating the sky. She recalled all the battles she had fought, all the times she had stood alone against the enemy. But now she was no longer alone. The cooperation between humanity and the traitor warriors in the Taraxian ranks had created a sudden shift in the course of the war. "You know, Celia," Kian continued, "once we realized that war isn't just about strength, but about the ability to change the course of things, we've already won half the battle." Celia turned to look at Kian, recognizing the wisdom and foresight in his words. She knew that humanity didn't always have the advantage in military strength, but they had something no other species had: the ability to change the way wars are fought, the ability to innovate and adapt. And it was that very ability that had helped them survive and overcome the greatest challenges. The rescue ships had left Ymir's sky carrying human warriors and traitor Taraxian warriors alike. They had not only secured a victory, but had also left a grand mark for humanity in the universe. No longer weak, no longer victims of invading empires, humanity had now proven that they could stand shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful forces in the universe. As the human warships entered space, Kian looked at the starry sky where the battles had taken place, where Taraxian and human ships had collided. "We didn't just win one battle, Celia," he said. "We've created a new world, a world where humanity will no longer be threatened by anyone." Celia looked at Kian, her heart filled with pride and resolve. She understood that this was just the beginning. Humans and Taraxians would no longer be enemies but allies in a universe that was constantly changing. She knew she would never go back to the way things were. Her choice not only changed her, but would change the lives of future generations. "Thank you," Kian. Celia said, her voice soft but resolute. "Without you, I wouldn't have realized that war isn't just about defeating the enemy. It's about changing oneself." Kian smiled, his eyes sparkling with wisdom, but also full of hope. "And without you, we wouldn't have had the chance to change this war." The war wasn't over, but humanity could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Though many challenges lay ahead, at least they had proven their strength in this universe. Kian and Celia, along with warriors from both species, would continue to fight. They were no longer fighting just for their survival, but for a future where humanity could create a future where war was not about destruction, but about opportunity for change and growth. Humanity had proven one thing: they were not just capable of surviving, they were capable of leading the universe in a completely new way. They would not just be the inheritors of Earth, but the ones who opened a new chapter for all species in the universe. The war had completely transformed. No longer was it a clash between massive armies, but now humanity had proven that intellect and strategy could overcome physical strength. As Celia looked back on the battle, she couldn't help but feel exhilarated. She had witnessed remarkable changes, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of regret when thinking about her comrades who had sacrificed their lives due to the mistakes of the Taraxian leadership. The human warships still hovered in the sky, and waves of attacks continued. The traitor warriors within the Taraxian ranks maintained their role, providing valuable information and guiding humanity in the right direction. Each attack was carefully planned, not only with force, but with subtlety and strategy. Kian stood on the warship watching the battle screens. The human warriors had begun to seize Taraxian strategic bases. The defense systems had been broken, and now the human forces were approaching critical targets that once seemed untouchable. "We've planned meticulously," Kian said to Celia, his voice confident and decisive. "Humanity doesn't just rely on strength to win. We know how to leverage intelligence and strategy. That's why we won't just win this war, we'll change the course of the universe. Celia remained silent, feeling Kian's words as a strong affirmation. She looked at the screen where the human warships were closing in on Taraxian bases. The human fleet wasn't just fighting with modern weapons, but also with intellect and the ability to anticipate the enemy. The strategies humanity applied couldn't be broken, and this was making a Taraxian pay a heavy price. One of humanity's most notable strategies was information warfare. They had rendered Taraxian defense systems useless. The human warriors didn't just rely on destructive power. They used tactics to jam information, confusing the Taraxians into not being able to tell which targets were real and which were decoys. Taraxian alarm systems were disabled, and their warriors could no longer launch effective attacks. This is how we fight, Kian continued, his gaze bright. Not by total destruction, but by making our enemy unable to cope with us. We make them unable to see clearly. Celia looked at Kian, feeling a change within herself. She had once fought for strength, for loyalty, but now she had learned that victory didn't always come from power. It came from intelligence and strategy. Humanity's strategies had made Taraxians pay dearly. Their defense systems were gradually being destroyed, and their forces were broken not by weapons, but by the infiltration of their minds and plans. As Celia and Kian looked at the screen, they saw that the human warships were taking control of the bases. The traitor Taraxian warriors, now standing beside humanity, were witnessing the collapse of their own army. But not out of resentment, rather because they realized that humanity had done what was right. They weren't just fighting for their survival, they were fighting for a fairer universe. Humanity is no longer invaded, Kian said, his voice low but strong. We've become warriors, and we will never let ourselves be oppressed again. Celia nodded, her heart filled with trust. They had created a revolution in warfare, not through destruction or brutality, but through strategy and wisdom. And this would be the reason humanity would not only survive in the universe, but stand strong as a powerful force. The war wasn't over, but humanity had proven that they could change the course of the battle not just through physical strength, but through superior creativity and strategy. As the human warships continued to attack, Celia knew that no matter how many more battles came, they had already won. Not because of strength, but because of creativity and the ability to adapt to any situation. Humanity had changed the way war was fought, and this. As Celia stood on the deck of the human warship, gazing at the planet, Ymir slowly sinking beneath the light of distant explosions, she felt a strange sensation. This planet had once been a battlefield where the Taraxian invasion nearly wiped out humanity. But now it was humanity that was in control of the universe. Not because of physical strength, but because of the change they brought, the strategies and creativity of a species that had gradually proven that survival doesn't only come from violence, but from the ability to adapt and shift the course of events. Humanity was no longer the easy target, no longer the weak creatures being invaded and conquered. Now they stood on equal footing with the most powerful empires in the universe, and in fact they had become an indispensable force. The strategies humanity employed didn't just shock the Taraxians, but also created a new model of warfare where intelligence and creativity surpassed even military might. We've come a long way, Celia Kian said, standing next to her, his eyes gazing far into the vastness of space. From a planet under invasion, humanity has now become a cosmic force, not because we have the strongest army, but because we've learned to fight with intellect and strategy. Celia looked at him silent. She realized that Kian's words weren't just prideful, they were the truth. Humanity wasn't just surviving anymore. They had truly rebuilt their lives rather than simply fleeing from annihilation. They no longer only had brave warriors, they also had those who knew how to use technology and strategy to change the course of every war. Throughout the war, Celia had witnessed tactics she never could have imagined before. Human warriors didn't just fight with weapons, they fought with insight. For instance, they used information warfare to weaken the Taraxian defense systems. They exploited the enemy's weaknesses and seized every small opportunity. Despite not having colossal warships or vast armies like the Taraxians, humanity knew how to leverage their strategic advantages. Kian continued, his voice deep and resolute. That's why we're not just survivors. We're the ones changing the game. We will never let ourselves be oppressed again. We're not just standing up for survival, but for the future of all species in the universe. Celia nodded. She felt the truth in Kian's words. Humanity was no longer weak. They had learned to use intellect, creativity, and perseverance to win not just in war, but in life. From a small species on a distant planet, they had risen to become a force that even the strongest empires in the universe now had to reckon with. Both Kian and Celia knew that this war wasn't over. The universe was vast and humanity would face many more challenges ahead. But what mattered was that humanity had proven one thing: they could not only survive, they could lead changing the course of every battle. We will lead wars in the future, but not the Taraxian way, Kian added, his eyes gleaming with confidence. We will fight with intellect, creativity, and determination. We will create a world where survival is not a violent struggle, but a continuous process of change, adaptation, and development. Celia looked into Kian's face and she knew he was right. This war wasn't just about winning or losing, it was about how humanity would shape the future of the universe. And from now on, they wouldn't just be outsiders. They would be the leaders, the ones who decided how to win, and their victory wouldn't come through destruction, but through innovation. The universe now would have to acknowledge humanity as a force not to be ignored, a force that didn't just fight to survive, but fought to change the world. And so they would not only be the inheritors of Earth, but the pioneers of a new era in the universe. Under the light of a star-filled universe, the betrayal within the Taraxian ranks was not just a stain, it was the key that opened the door to changing the course of the war. The traitors, the Taraxian warriors, were no longer just the weak, forgotten ones. They had become the most powerful figures in the universe. For them, the decision to betray wasn't an act of cowardice, but a long-term strategy, a move that would change not just the war, but also how species viewed strength and power. Kian stood beside Celia on the human warship, observing the unfolding changes. The traitor warriors had completely shifted the balance of the Taraxian forces. Though Taraxians had once been considered one of the strongest empires in the universe, the betrayal had caused them to lose the strategic advantage they once held. The entire system had been broken from within. I can't believe the people I fought alongside are doing this. Celia sighed, her eyes betraying her disappointment. She had dedicated her life to protecting the Taraxians, but now she had to face the reality that her own comrades had betrayed the organization she had once been completely loyal to. Kian looked at her sympathetically. No one can change what has happened, Celia. But what you do now is what matters. We can make a difference from this point on. The traitor warriors not only provided crucial information, but also used their betrayal to infiltrate Taraxian bases. These warriors helped humanity launch unpredictable attacks. Their small actions caused chaos within the Taraxian ranks, making their army unable to coordinate as effectively as before. Too much information was leaked, too many systems were broken, and the Taraxian strategy became meaningless. This wasn't just a war between humanity and the Taraxians. It was a war about trust and betrayal. The traitor warriors caused an unexpected reversal in the course of the war. They didn't just create a new relationship between humanity and these warriors, they made the remaining Taraxians question themselves. Were they really fighting for a just cause? At the same time, Celia began to realize a truth she hadn't considered before. Though she had once fought for a grand ideal, she now saw that ideal no longer existed. The traitors were the ones who understood that war wasn't a struggle between the strongest, it was a struggle between those who could maintain trust and loyalty. And now humanity was the one holding on to that trust, despite lacking the physical strength of the Taraxians. We've changed the game, Celia sighed, looking out the ship's window. Not because of strength, but because of determination and intellect. Humanity's strategies have completely changed the way we fight. Kian nodded. Exactly. And that's why we won't stop here. Humanity hasn't just won, we've changed how the universe views strength and warfare. Although the war between humanity and the Taraxians was far from over, one thing was certain: the betrayal within the Taraxian ranks had completely changed the course of the war. The traitor warriors had helped humanity win, not just through strength, but through creativity, strategy, and the ability to recognize the enemy's weaknesses. Celia felt a profound change within herself. She was no longer a lone warrior of the Taraxians. She was part of the change, part of a new world. The traitor warriors hadn't just helped humanity win, they had helped them build a fairer universe. She knew that despite the challenges ahead, humanity would never again be weak. They had proven that no matter the circumstances, they could always create change. We won't just survive, Kian Salia said, her voice deep and resolute. We will change everything that has held us back, and the world will have to acknowledge that. Kian looked at her, his eyes shining with trust and pride. That's right. Humanity isn't just surviving. We will be the ones to create the world we want to live in, and the Taraxian betrayal is our opportunity. The universe would never be the same again. Humanity had become a force that all species would have to acknowledge. Through intelligent strategy and a bit of luck, they had changed the course of the war and reshaped this universe. The Taraxian betrayal wasn't just a stain in history, it was a grand opportunity for humanity to prove that they could win, not just through strength, but by identifying and exploiting their enemies' weaknesses. As the war neared its end for Kian and Celia, it was no longer just a battle between humanity and the Taraxians. The war had become a long journey. They walked together not just as battle partners, but as companions, each with their own ideals, yet all moving toward a shared future. With every step, every decision they made together, they gradually changed, growing closer and understanding each other more. Kian looked at Celia, sensing the change in her. Though she was a Taraxian warrior, she was no longer the person he had first met, a strong and resilient fighter, fiercely determined to protect her empire. Now she stood with humanity, fighting for freedom and a more just universe. She had abandoned her past to rise with a new ideal, and Kian couldn't help but feel a deep respect for her. For Celia, Kian had caused her to re-examine the world and her understanding of the war. He wasn't just a mechanical engineer, he was a symbol of creativity and perseverance. He never faltered in the face of adversity, and every decision he made was with foresight and vision. That was why, despite her initial view of humans as weak beings, she now saw them not just as survivors, but as ones who could change the course of the universe. Did you ever think we'd be standing here together fighting for a common cause? Kian asked, his voice gentle yet thoughtful. The question was not just about their partnership, but about the change in both of them through this war. Celia paused for a moment, her gaze becoming distant, as though looking into a far-off past. I never thought I would do this. But sometimes when you see the truth, you can't go back. I chose to stand with humanity, and that has changed me forever. Kian smiled, not out of pride, but because of the mutual understanding between them. Maybe change is exactly what we needed in this war, Celia. Not just a change in how we fight, but a change within ourselves. They didn't need to say more. They both understood that this war had not only changed the world around them, but had also transformed them. The battles, the decisions they had to make had forced them to face hard choices, but it had also helped them realize the value of collaboration, resilience, and trust in a better future. When Celia looked at Kian, she saw not only a companion, but also a model of wisdom and perseverance. He wasn't just fighting for humanity's survival, but to create a universe where trust, creativity, and determination could replace violence and oppression. Thank you, Kian, Celia said, her voice soft. If not for you, I would never have understood that war isn't just about defeating the enemy, but about changing oneself. Kian looked at her, his eyes sparkling with understanding. Thank you, Celia. Without you, I wouldn't have known what humanity was truly capable of changing. And though many challenges still lay ahead, they knew the war was no longer just about survival. It was a war to rebuild this world, to create a future where no one had to live under the shadow of oppression, where creativity and understanding were valued more than brutality. They knew they were standing at a major crossroads in history, and together with humanity and the traitor Taraxian warriors, they would be the ones to decide the direction of this universe. Wars were never just about winning or losing, they were about the changes they created. And for Kian and Celia, they clearly saw that the change they were part of was not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a new era. As the human warriors and the traitor Taraxian warriors continued to work together, attacking the last Taraxian strongholds, the sky over Ymir finally grew still. The human warships no longer faced waves of attacks from the Taraxian warriors. They had truly won. Not because humanity was stronger militarily, but because they had used intellect, creativity, and resilience to turn the tide. Kian stood on the warship, his gaze directed toward the vast expanse of space. The universe was no longer a place where humanity feared looking up at the sky. Now it was an open space full of opportunities for them to rise and become a powerful, undeniable force. They had proven that humanity was not just an invaded species, but one that could change the game. Celia stood beside Kian, wearing the Taraxian warrior's gauntlet, but her gaze was no longer filled with the fierce determination of battle. Instead, she saw in the stars before her a new future, a future where humanity was no longer a victim, but a leader. "We've won," Celia said, her voice low and filled with pride. "Not because of strength, but because of how we fought. We've changed the way wars are fought, and humanity has proven that they can stand firm in this universe." Kian nodded, his gaze still fixed on the distant sky. "Not just a victory in this war. This is a victory for humanity in the war with themselves. And now we can begin to rebuild." With every attack, every strategy humanity deployed, they gradually solidified their place in the universe. They hadn't just defeated the Taraxians, they had created a monumental shift, not only militarily, but politically and socially. The strategies humanity employed didn't just cause the Taraxians to fail, they taught all species that true strength wasn't just in armies and physical might. Real strength lies in the ability to adapt, innovate, and overcome challenges with intellect and resilience. Celia had chosen to stand with humanity not just for an ideal, but because she understood that the future couldn't be decided by violence alone. It had to be built on wise decisions, on determination, and on change. And she knew that despite their flaws, humanity always had the ability to shift the tides and create a better world. Kian looked at her, a slight smile on his lips. "We're not just fighting for our survival anymore. We're fighting for a just world, for a universe where humanity will never have to live in fear again." This was not an end. It was a beginning. The beginning of a new era where humanity was no longer the victims of oppression, but the ones who decided the fate of this universe. They would no longer run from invasions, but instead they would lead revolutions, creating strategies that other species would have to bow to. "You've changed so much," Celia, Kian said, his gaze sweeping across the stars ahead. "We've changed so much. And this war will be a defining moment for humanity. We will not just survive, we will lead." Celia didn't answer immediately, but her eyes shone with determination. She was no longer a lone warrior. She was part of a new world, a world where humanity would stand strong and change how other species saw them. And she understood that no matter the obstacles ahead, humanity would always rise, always fight for a better future. The human warships streaked across space, leaving shining trails in the universe. A new world was being formed, and humanity had proven they were not just survivors. They were the ones who could control their own destiny and that of the entire universe. At the same time, the war was no longer just a conflict between two species. It had become a lesson, a wake-up call for all those who thought the military might alone could decide the fate of a war. Humanity, with its intellect, creativity, and resilience, had completely changed the way wars were fought. From intricate tactics to information warfare, they had proven that humanity could win not only through strength, but through intelligence and the ability to identify the weaknesses of their opponents. Kian and Celia continued to observe the battles being fought under human leadership. Each wave of attack was carefully planned, with every detail calculated to exploit the Taraxians' weaknesses. The traitors within the Taraxian ranks continued their tireless work, providing valuable information on the weak points of the Taraxian strategy. It was this information that enabled humanity to effectively plan their counterattacks. One of the key strategies humanity employed was information warfare. They developed technologies that disrupted Taraxian communication signals, preventing their forces from coordinating effectively. False signals were inserted, creating chaos within the Taraxian ranks, making it impossible for them to distinguish between real targets and traps. Humanity's attacks were not just a display of violence, but a penetration into the minds and strategies of the enemy. "What we're doing is breaking their plans from within," Kian explained to Celia, never taking his eyes off the battle display. "It's not just about destroying physical targets. We're destroying their psychology." Celia nodded, realizing that modern warfare had evolved far beyond what she had once known. She had always believed that a war could only end when one side was completely defeated militarily, but now she understood that humanity had opened a completely new concept. They didn't fight just with weapons. They fought with intellect, with endless creativity, and the ability to turn every situation into an opportunity. Kian continued to point at the battle display. We've made the Taraxians pay a heavy price, not only because their strategies have been overturned, but because they could never predict what we would do next. They couldn't see their own weaknesses. Celia could feel the tension in the air. A war was not just about strength. It was about perception and the ability to respond to continuous change. Humanity had proven they could adapt to any situation, even when facing a mighty empire like the Taraxians. Every strategy humanity deployed was aimed at weakening the Taraxians' ability to respond, leaving them always in a state of vulnerability. I was wrong, Celia said softly but loud enough for Kian to hear. We, the Taraxians, were too complacent. We thought that only military power mattered. But you, humanity, have shown us that victory doesn't come from having the strongest army. It comes from knowing how to exploit every weakness and always being ready to adapt. Kian looked at her, saying nothing, just offering a gentle smile. He knew that the change in Celia's thinking was a crucial sign, not just for the victory in this war, but because of the change in her mindset from a warrior determined to defend an empire to someone who understood that war wasn't just about power, but about creativity and innovation. You're no longer fighting for an ideal, Celia, Kian said, his voice full of respect. You're fighting for a future, a world where all of us can coexist and thrive. And that's why we won't stop after this war. We'll continue to build a fair universe where intellect and creativity are valued. Celia looked at the display where human warships continued to attack the Taraxian bases. This war wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of a new era where creative strategies and the ability to adapt would decide the future of the universe. Humanity had proven that they could not only survive, but they could lead changing the course of this universe. And Celia, along with Kian, knew that this war would not just end in a victory, but would open new opportunities for anyone who dared to change, dared to embrace creativity, and dared to recognize their own weaknesses. The war between humanity and the Taraxians was drawing to a close. Human warships had secured the strategic areas of the Taraxians, and soon after the last of the Taraxian bases on the planet, Ymir, were destroyed. The sky lit up with violent explosions, but with each echo of destruction, humanity took another step forward in their journey to reshape the universe. Kian and Celia stood on the human warship, gazing toward Ymir. It was no longer a battleground, but a place where they had proven that humanity could stand firm in this universe. The war was over, but its impact would resonate forever. We did it, Kian said, his voice soft but full of pride. This isn't just a victory in this war, but a victory for humanity. A victory not because we were stronger, but because we understood that war isn't about destruction, it's about change. We fought with intellect, not just strength. Celia looked at him, and in her gaze there was a clear transformation. She had once been a warrior of the Taraxians, fighting for power and the dominance of her empire, but now she realized this war wasn't just about temporary victories, it was about rebuilding what had been destroyed. I've changed, Kian. I'm no longer fighting for a misguided ideal. I'm fighting for the future of all of us. Kian nodded, understanding that she had not only changed in spirit, but had come to recognize the great mission humanity now carried. We've all changed, Celia, and now we can build a different world, a world where all species can coexist, not in oppression and war, but in peace and creativity. Celia looked toward the vastness of space where human warships continued to move, not just conquering space, but also building a new future. We didn't just defeat the Taraxians. We've proven that humanity can change this world. We can be the leaders not just because of military power, but because of our creativity and resilience. The vast universe was no longer a dangerous place, but an open space where humanity could rise and thrive. They hadn't just fought for survival, they fought to create a new future where all beings, whether strong or weak, could live together in peace. That was the victory humanity had achieved. We won't stop here, Kian said, his eyes shining with determination. This war is just the beginning. We will build an alliance, a world where humanity doesn't just survive, but leads protecting all the other species in the universe. Celia nodded, her heart filled with belief and hope. We won't just be warriors anymore. We'll be leaders, the ones who create change. And humanity will never be forgotten in this universe. Human warships continued to glide through space, their light reflecting off distant stars. The Taraxian ships no longer appeared, and the shadow of oppression no longer loomed over the universe. Instead, there was a new light, a light that humanity had kindled. This was their moment to prove that even as the weakest species, they could change the course of the universe. In the darkness of space, humanity had stood firm and created a new world. A world where war was not destruction, but change, creativity, and a new beginning. The end of this war was not just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of a new era, one where humanity would not only survive but lead, guide, and change the entire universe's course.